March 1, 1896, the wind bit cold across the rocky ridges above the town of Adwa. Dust clung to the hems of uniforms and the leather of boots. The sun crouched low, hard and white, like a coin pressed against a sky that offered nothing soft. Men moved in columns and loose clusters, faces set, eyes narrowed against glare and grit. You could hear the clink of harness, the low murmur of orders, the rasp of canvas of greatcoats when the cold hit. Somewhere below, in the valleys, flutes of smoke rose from cooking fires and from the smoking mouths of field guns. On one ridge stood the Italian officers, smart in their dark tunics, gold braid catching the light. Their banners hummed. General Oreste Baratieri had drawn his lines with the certainty of a man who believed maps could command reality. He had a small professional army behind him, a mix of metropolitan regiments and colonial troops, Eritrean and askari, in lighter gear, rifles slung, bayonets fixed, limbers, and artillery in columns. Men checked the steel of their weapons, tamped cartridges, adjusted belts and caps. From time to time, someone shouted a numerical order. The officers replied with clipped words and quick gestures. The machine of modern warfare hummed like a well-oiled clock. Across the valley and up the ridgelines, the Ethiopian camp spread like a different world. Colors and textures, rough spun cloaks, the glint of spear tips, plumes, and hair braids caught in the wind. Center stage, calm as a mountain itself, stood Menelik II. The emperor was not a soldier of parade, he was broad-shouldered, deliberate-eyed, a man who had learned power by negotiation and by weathering storms of his own. At his side, Empress Tetu stood in command of her own corps of warriors. She would be a governor of morale as much as of strategy. Couriers ran along paths and through gorges, delivering messages in a language of urgency and faith. The Ethiopian force was a mosaic, provincial levies, veteran warriors from Shoa and Tigre, horsemen who lived off the land, and crucially riflemen newly supplied with modern firearms. For years, Menelik had been quietly buying the same weapons the Europeans trusted: breech-loading rifles, percussion technology, and artillery pieces. He had woven these tools into traditional tactics, marrying shock and maneuver with close combat prowess. Where Italian doctrine expected neat lines and predictable advance, Menelik's army brought flexible masses that melted into ravines and swarmed across ridges. Tension pulsed through the air like an electrical charge. The Italians believed themselves the bearers of modern discipline and superior firepower. Their officers scanned the ridgelines and convinced themselves, because that was the habit of empires, that the native force could be managed, broken, or cajoled into submission. Baratieri's staff read intelligence that sounded reasonable on paper. Enemy numbers, supply estimates, a confidence that a punch of well-placed volleys would unmake this gathering. Yet maps and papers do not speak of the smell of smoke from 1,000 cooking fires or the look in a man's eye when his land is at stake. The first shots that morning were not a trickle, but the sharp punctuation of a world about to overturn. Skirmishers, young soldiers from both sides, tested each other with rifle fire along the edges of the gullies. The Italians replied with disciplined volleys. Then the ground changed character. What looked like scattered detachments were in fact converging columns. Ethiopian units slid down from higher plateaus, chewing up the ground in waves, then disappearing into folds in the terrain, only to reappear behind the Italian flanks. Menelik's orders spread like wildfire: hold no single ridge as an altar, use the land, and above all, strike as one living system. Panic flossed through the Italian lines when their supply of clean, ordered space collapsed into confusion. The regiments that had expected to hold together found themselves outflanked by horsemen and riflemen who moved like streams, filling gaps where maps had shown only empty land. The trained volleys that had been the Italian heartbeat faltered under crossfire from unexpected directions. Artillery could not be repositioned fast enough on ridges carved by ancient erosion. Men fell in clusters. Officers included music of battle replacing the hum of routine. The colonial askari, loyal but stretched thin, tried to plug holes, and by time, flags dipped, officers barked. Menelik watched and measured the rhythm of the collapse, sending reserves to points where the Italian line showed the first deep cracks. Close combat became inevitable, where landscapes funneled men into choke points, bayonets met spears, muskets rang against shields. There was the metallic sound of struggle and the breathing of those who fought and those who fled. Ethiopian warriors used whatever they could, captured rifles, closed quarters, a roaring ferocity born of defending home. Empress Tetu's presence on the field tightened wills. Her couriers carried orders that sounded more like blessing than command, and the soldiers moved with that combined force. By midday, the Italian position had fractured. Where they had expected neat tactical withdrawal, they encountered an organized, implacable encirclement. Menelik's army numerous, disciplined where it mattered, and guided by a leader who understood the land as an ally threw itself against the neatness of European doctrine and shredded it. The Italian retreat turned into a rout. Horses stumbled, wagons were abandoned, and prisoners were taken by the hundreds. At the center of the chaos was the bitter, impossible recognition that modernity's trappings, uniforms, polished rifles, European drill manuals were not destiny. Power on this day answered instead to who understood the hills and the heart of those who fought on them. The world would take notice, news would rush back to capitals, and the echoes of Adwa would travel across oceans and through time. For now the ridges held the scent of victory, the sound of shouts, and the heavy, astonished silence of men who had been surprised. The dust from Adwa was still settling when word began to ripple far beyond the Horn of Africa. 2 men standing in cafes in Rome, and 2 ministers sitting behind polished desks, the defeat felt like something impossible. An empire was not supposed to lose to the people it intended to rule. Yet that was exactly what had happened, and the humiliation clung to Italy like a stain that never quite washed out. In Ethiopia, Adwa tightened the spine of a nation. Menelik to return to Addis Ababa not as a symbol, but as proof that Africa could outfight and outthink a European power. The streets filled with dancers and warriors holding up captured rifles. Priests sang. Messengers arrived from kingdoms across the continent offering congratulations. Even far away in black communities in the Caribbean, the United States, and Brazil, the name Adwa began to carry the weight of something sacred. It meant possibility, it meant dignity, it meant that the world was not as fixed as Europeans claimed. But time doesn't freeze. Even around victories, the decades moved. The Italian state hardened, new leaders rose. In Rome, nationalist politicians kept Adwa alive like an open wound. They invoked it in speeches, in military academies, in newspapers. They used it as a spark to ignite their audiences. The message was simple: Italy had a score to settle. By the 1930s, that anger found its champion in a man with a jaw set like stone and a hunger for spectacle. Benito Mussolini called himself Il Duce. He wanted an empire of steel, a Mediterranean he could point to and call his lake, and a trophy that would wipe away the memory of Baratieri's disaster. Ethiopia, he decided, would be that trophy. On the other side of the Red Sea, a new generation of Ethiopian leaders understood exactly what this meant. Standing at the center of it all was Haile Selassie. Where Menelik had been a mountain, Selassie was a blade, lean, precise, a man who believed in law and in the careful weight of diplomacy. He walked hallways lined with foreign visitors, he read treaties. He studied Europe with the wary patience of someone who knew the continent admired itself too much. He also knew Ethiopia had enemies. For years he watched Italian engineers carve roads through Eritrea. He watched new forts rise where old trails had been. He heard reconnaissance planes buzzing overhead like metallic insects. Mussolini wasn't hiding anything. He wanted round 2. But Selassie wasn't a man who panicked. He modernized the army step by step. He bought new rifles when he could. He trained officers. He strengthened the Imperial Guard. He tried, in his own way, to build a 20th century force on 19th century resources. By 1935, the Italian war machine was in motion. Troopships packed with infantry, tanks, and crates of munitions steamed toward East Africa. Columns of armored cars rolled across Eritrea's roads. Italian commanders studied maps with a hunger that bordered on obsession. Mussolini wanted a victory that would erase Adwa from the memory of Europe. The soldiers sent to deliver that victory didn't know the full weight of what they carried, but they felt it. Every briefing mentioned 1896. Every officer understood that they were marching toward history's unfinished business. Inside Ethiopia, the mood tightened like a drum skin. Warriors from every province rode toward the front. Some carried rifles, some carried spears. Some traveled for days across cracked plains and over cold mountain passes. They came because the emperor called and because their fathers had stood at Adwa and proven something to the world. No one wanted to be the generation that failed to defend that legacy. On cold mornings, before sunrise, Selassie would stand outside his tent and listen to the sound of troops assembling. There were thousands of them, some disciplined and uniformed, some wild and fearless, some quiet and reflective. All understood the stakes. This wouldn't be Adwa. Italy wasn't marching with 19th-century rifles and outdated tactics anymore. Mussolini's army had tanks, trucks, artillery batteries that could fire shells across distances Menelik's generals never had to imagine. Worst of all, in sealed containers inside their camps, the Italian invaders carried the one weapon Selassie feared more than any other: chemical gas. The emperor knew he couldn't match Italy on technology, but he believed he could match them on resolve. He walked through the camps with a calm expression, greeting officers by name, blessing soldiers as priests chanted prayers. One evening, while the sun slipped behind the mountains like a dying ember, he told his generals something simple. Adwa was not an accident, and it was not the past. It is who we are. The officers nodded. They knew the task ahead would be brutal. But they also knew this truth: Ethiopia was not a defeated country waiting to be conquered. It was a nation preparing to prove itself again. Dawn arrived with a gray, heavy stillness over the northern front. The mountains were wrapped in mist, and the air tasted like metal. Italian troops stood in tight formations along the ridges near Adua and Aksum, the same landscapes their fathers and grandfathers had retreated across decades earlier. This time they carried Carcano rifles, gas masks clipped to their belts, and the confidence of modern artillery sitting behind them like iron guardians. Tank engines rumbled, radio operators murmured into headsets. Pilots tightened the straps of their flight helmets on the airfields. Many of those soldiers had grown up hearing about Adwa as a national shame. Now they were being told they would restore pride. But as they looked out at the mountains, some felt the same unease the First Italian army had felt. The land had a way of staring back at you. Across the valleys and along rocky escarpments, the Ethiopians gathered. You could hear them long before you saw them. Horses snorting, shields thudding, rifles being loaded. Priests chanting old war prayers that cut through the cold morning air. Men from Shoa, Oromia, Gondar, Tigre, Wallo, and every corner of the empire stood shoulder to shoulder. Some wore leather bandoliers, others still carried long spears polished for battle. Mixed among them were officers trained abroad, wearing crisp uniforms and giving sharp modern orders. Haile Selassie rode between the units on a dark horse, his cloak trailing softly behind him. Soldiers straightened their backs as he passed. Some tapped their chests in respect, some whispered prayers. The emperor nodded at each group, his expression steady and unreadable. He carried the weight of an entire nation, and he carried it in silence. When the first bombs fell, they didn't sound like explosions at first. They arrived as a whistle, then a hollow thump that shook the ground. The blast tore open the earth and sent men and horses scattering. Italian planes swept overhead in perfect formation, their engines humming with mechanical certainty. Dust clouds rose, shouts rippled through the Ethiopian lines. Selassie watched from a ridge as the battlefield changed shape under the power of machines he could not match. But then something happened the Italians didn't expect. The Ethiopian lines didn't break. Warriors who had grown up in these mountains used the terrain like a shield. They split into smaller units, darted along ridges, took cover behind boulders, and reappeared in places Italian officers swore were unreachable. Marksmen fired from crevices, riders struck supply columns. Scouts slipped behind enemy lines. The Italians had the technology, but the Ethiopians had the land. On the second day, Italian commanders ordered the use of chemical gas. Planes released drifting clouds that slid down the valleys like pale ghosts. The gas burned skin, blinded eyes, and choked lungs. It was a weapon meant to break morale, not just bodies. Selassie watched men collapse, watched horses rear in agony, watched priests wrap wet cloths over their mouths as they carried the wounded to safety, yet the lines still didn't break. Even Italian soldiers, standing behind their own protective masks, felt something twist inside them as they watched Ethiopian fighters push forward through the pain. Many of those men had never seen anyone fight for their homeland like this. They exchanged glances that their officers pretended not to notice. Some muttered the same sentence under their breath: "They fight like Adwa never ended." On the slopes of Ama-Aratum, Italian infantry walked straight into an ambush that felt ripped from the 19th century but executed with 20th century precision. Ethiopian riflemen perched on cliffs rained bullets down. When the Italians tried to retreat, mounted units cut them off. Entire divisions were pinned, forced into defensive pockets that stretched Italian nerves thin. Officers slammed their fists into map tables, unable to understand how a primitive army kept outmaneuvering them. The truth was simple: Ethiopia was fighting for survival. Italy was fighting for revenge. As the weeks rolled on, Mussolini's generals threw every advantage they had onto the field. More aircraft, more tanks, more gas, more artillery. The Ethiopians answered with grit, terrain mastery, and a unity Italy could never manufacture through propaganda. One night, after a brutal engagement near Mechu, an Italian captain sat in a tent flipping through a notebook while trying to steady his breathing. His men had barely escaped an encirclement. He wrote down something he didn't dare say aloud. We expected another colony, we found a nation, and he wasn't alone. Italians across the front whispered about the discipline of Selassie's imperial guard, the fearless charges of warriors who refused to yield, and the unshakable resolve of a people who had beaten them once and were determined to make them bleed for every inch now. But technology and poison gas eventually tipped the balance. Selassie knew it, his generals knew it. Ethiopia wasn't losing because it lacked courage. It was losing because Mussolini had broken every law of war and faced no consequences. The emperor made a decision that would haunt him for years. He ordered a strategic withdrawal so he could take his plea to the one place that claimed to value justice. He would go to Geneva. He would make the world look him in the eye. And every Italian soldier behind him would know exactly what he was saying by stepping onto that ship. This isn't surrender, this is testimony. August 1965. Brussels. In the marble halls of the Ministry of African Affairs, cigarette smoke curled through the air like ghosts that refused to leave. Maps of the Congo still hung on the walls, faded, outdated, and marked with red pins that meant nothing anymore. The Belgian officers sitting around the table weren't discussing expansion or governance now, they were dissecting failure. Colonel Adrien Duvivier, a veteran of both the Congo Free State campaigns and the early post-independence operations, stared down at the reports spread before him. Each document was a quiet humiliation: patrols overrun, supply lines cut, whole battalions routed by irregular forces. He had once been trained to believe that European discipline was invincible. Now, even he couldn't ignore the pattern. Congo had resisted Belgium with spears, and it had resisted them again with ideology. "Gentlemen," he said finally, tapping the report with 2 fingers, "this isn't war, it's memory." He wasn't wrong. What the Belgians failed to grasp, from Siri's Katanga to Mulil's Kwilu, was that they had never fought a conventional enemy. They had fought people who understood the land and each other in ways Europe never could. The Congolese didn't need fortresses. The jungle was one. They didn't need radio towers. They had rumor and rhythm. Their armies didn't march, they grew, like the forest itself. For decades, Belgian officers had mocked what they called bush warfare. They saw it as disorganized chaos, an absence of structure. But that was the blind spot. It wasn't chaos, it was flexibility. A living system that adapted faster than any European doctrine. While the Belgians wrote manuals, the Congolese rewrote the terrain beneath them. The greatest irony was that Belgian military historians later praised similar tactics when used by European partisans against the Nazis. Guerrilla war was brilliant in France, heroic in Poland, but primitive in Africa. The hypocrisy stung when Congo used those same tactics to throw off colonial control. In the years after the Simba Rebellion, Belgium's intelligence services quietly studied the reports again. They highlighted words like ambush, night assault, psychological warfare. They noted the discipline of the Congolese fighters, their ability to mobilize entire regions without radio communication. What they could not quantify was the force that made it all possible: the unbreakable will to reclaim dignity. To the Congolese, the spear had never just been a weapon. It was a symbol of identity, of defiance. When the guns failed, the spear still spoke. And that terrified men like Duvivier more than bullets ever could. Even years later, in Belgian military academies, young cadets would read sanitized versions of these campaigns: how the natives resisted, how order was restored. What they wouldn't read was the fear in the hearts of men who had seen a spear flash out of darkness and realized that the empire they served was built on borrowed time. The Congo had taught them, again and again, that technology doesn't guarantee victory, understanding does. And yet, the deeper tragedy is that these lessons didn't stop the exploitation. The mines kept running, the corporations kept extracting, and new wars kept smoldering in the same soil. The weapons got bigger, but the reason stayed the same: control, profit, and fear of losing both. Still, beneath the surface, the spirit that fueled Msiri's warriors and the Simba rebels never vanished. It lived in songs, in whispers, in the quiet pride of a people who knew they had faced an empire with nothing but courage and strategy, and made that empire tremble. If you listen closely, that spirit is still there, in the chants of miners on strike, in the young protesters shouting against corruption, in the rhythm of drums that refused to fade under the noise of imported radios. The story never ended, it just changed its battlefield. Because what Belgium never understood, and what Congo has never forgotten, is that resistance isn't about weapons. It's about memory, and memory, once awakened, doesn't die.